Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So today I wanted to talk about a story that's been uh, in the news and talked about on social media a lot, and that's supposed new evidence regarding the uh, lab leak hypothesis about the origins of COVID, published in a Substack piece by Michael Shellenberger, Matt Taibbi, and Alex Guttentag. So, I just want to start by looking at a tweet that Matt Taibbi made about his article. I mean, not Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberg. What the hell? Sorry. So he says many say it doesn't matter where COVID-19 came from, but it does. And, I agree that it does, despite lots of people I know saying that it doesn't, because, it's important to understand the origins of such things so we can be better prepared the next time. And also because, it just says something about our capacity to think critically and try to use evidence to get at the truth if we choose one view versus the other without taking a objective look at the evidence. So I want to discuss whether in fact Shellenberger et al. Did so in their new piece. So let's talk about Shellenberger a little bit first of all. He says the cover-up of COVID's origin typifies institutional rot. Our leaders have been lying and persecuting whistleblowers, etc. Well, I mean, when you consider that the vast majority of scientists with relevant expertise think that it's not very likely that COVID originated with a leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab there in Wuhan, the city where the COVID pandemic began, and think it's a lot more likely that it originated in an animal market in Wuhan, the Huanan Seafood Market, that sold wild animals that are known to be carriers and transmitters of COVID-19 and other coronaviruses, and that it originated in nature and then infected animals on wild animal farms. So the majority of scientists who have expertise relevant to the matter think that that's the most likely origin of COVID. Whereas most politicians, including from the very beginning, the Trump administration and its supporters, most Republicans, and then later the Biden administration, many in the Democratic establishment, jumped on board pushing the claim that COVID originated with a lab leak. So, you have a divide in opinion among those in positions of power. So why is it that one particular view held and promoted by powerful institutions is institutional rot, so to speak, but another view also held by people in powerful institutions is not institutional rot? A contrasting view on the same exact issue. And I'm curious, what does Shellenberger, who is making this claim, think about the view pushed by many back in 2016 and for several years after that Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election, which his own colleague, co-author on this piece, Matt Taibbi, investigated in depth and didn't find any evidence for? Why is it that institutional rot? Why isn't promotion of the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, institutional rot, or claims about so-called genocide against the Uyghur population in China, which has been promoted until recently by the U.S. government. The claim that the Syrian government waged gas attacks on its own population during the Syrian civil war, right when the government was on the verge of winning the war against the terrorists who were part of the coalition trying to overthrow that government. That was investigated. It was promoted by the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Lots of members of the U.S. political establishment. And it was investigated in depth and challenged by Michael Shellenberger's colleague in the Twitter Files investigations, Aaron Mate. And so, is that not institutional rot that the U.S. government has been claiming that the Syrian government waged this gas attack? That according to investigative journalist Aaron Mate, there's no evidence for. And frankly, Shellenberger has a very strong political bias against China. I don't disagree with him on every issue, but I think in general, he's a right-leaning, anti-communist who he bashes China every chance he gets. And here, later in this thread, he calls China a totalitarian society, whereas he calls the United States a democracy. And, again, his colleagues have been investigating ways in which the way the U.S. government and U.S. society in general functions isn't very democratic, where you have government officials colluding with social media outlets to censor public opinion. But he calls China a totalitarian society. Well, as you know, if you watch his channel, I've had a number of conversations, on the bitter pill with a fellow who's lived in China for over 18 years. I guess it's 19 now. And you could ask him or any number of people who live in China, and the vast majority of them would not agree with that characterization. Okay, so what is their claim? It was first put forward in an article just by Shellenberger himself. His titled, so the New York Post is titled, "We now know the first 3 people to get COVID worked in the Wuhan lab." So my question is, how do you know? As I said in my response to him on his Twitter thread, your Substack article is titled "First People Sickened by COVID-19 Were Chinese Scientists at Wuhan Institute of Virology, say U.S. government sources." But what government sources? Michael Gordon and his colleagues wrote the original Wall Street Journal article claiming that 3 Wuhan Institute of Virology employees got sick with an unspecified respiratory illness, citing anonymous current and former government officials as its sources. Well, who is Michael Gordon, you may ask? Well, he's a journalist who not only wrote this article in the Wall Street Journal, Intelligence on Sick Staff at Wuhan Lab Fuels Debate on COVID-19 Origin. First author of that article. He also wrote this one in 2002. Threats and responses. The Iraqis, U.S. says, Hussein intensifies quest for A-bomb parts. New York Times article by Michael Gordon and Judith Miller, September 8th, 2002. So this was the most widely read or widely viewed article promoting the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Same guy. You promoted this claim, and now he's promoting the claim that you know COVID came about through a lab leak, and the supposed evidence for this is that U.S. government officials claim. Kind of like U.S. government officials claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. The supposed evidence is U.S. government officials, anonymous current and former government officials, claim that 3 WIV employees got sick with a virus that had symptoms consistent with COVID-19. So my question to Michael was, what officials, and how do you know that information can be trusted? How do these sources claim to know for a fact that these 3 people had COVID? Were they tested? Your article doesn't say. And if there were 3 WIV staff who had COVID in November 2019, does that necessarily mean that that's who was responsible for the first major outbreak? Which, by the way, was centered around the Huanan Seafood Market, not the lab. I'll get to that in more detail later. So how did that outbreak happen to occur in the region of the market, or among employees or visitors to the market, rather than anywhere else in Wuhan, if the source of the outbreak was workers from the lab? Why wouldn't they have contributed to major outbreaks in other places in Wuhan that are a lot more commonly visited than this seafood market, which also sold wild land animals? And so that, just in general, my question to Michael and his co-authors, Matt Taibbi and Alex Guttentag, is, how do you know that these sources are trustworthy? Now, as far as the claim that these 3 scientists at the Wuhan lab had COVID, they actually couldn't have been tested for COVID at the time they were supposedly ill with it, November 2019. They would have, because the test for COVID, they didn't even know that COVID existed at that time. It wasn't until like the very beginning of January that they were like, oh, there's a novel respiratory virus that we've never seen before, and they rapidly sequenced it, identified it, and came up with a way of testing for it. But that didn't exist in November. All they had to go on was attempts to diagnose what was wrong, and of course, they wouldn't necessarily have been able to pin down what these 3 people had. If they it says they went to the hospital, but one thing about China is that going to the hospital doesn't necessarily mean you're hospitalized, that you're sick enough to stay in the hospital, because people in China often go to hospitals to get routine medical treatments. Don't have anything seriously wrong with them. So we don't know with these guys. And there was a flu epidemic at the time. So how do we know that they didn't just have the flu? Someone here points out, assuming 5% probability of getting the yearly flu, and taking half of the staff to be scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, we get a probability of greater than 98% that 3 or more workers at the WIV got infected by the flu. By Occam's razor, that's the most likely explanation, but only if you don't have a book to sell. He's referring to somebody who, Alina Chan, who wrote a book promoting the lab leak theory about the origins of COVID. So they might have had the flu. We don't know what they had. We don't even know for sure if there were three individuals who were sick. You know, uh, did you trust the government officials who claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction? I don't know. Unless we find out a lot more details than what's being given to us, about how they know these people had, COVID, then, you I'm not inclined to take it all that seriously. Okay, well, let me just go through uh, some more of what Shellenberger says here. He says start of his article says it's no longer a question that the COVID-19 virus leaked from China's notorious Wuhan Institute of Virology laboratory. Um, what's more, this week, my colleagues Matt Taibbi, Alex Guttentag, and I broke the explosive story that the first three people sickened by the virus were the scientists experimenting with SARS-like coronaviruses. Again, just making a definitive statement when, this is not something that he knows for a fact from anything that he's said. Because for one thing, if it really is true that these three people, got sick with COVID in November of 2019, how did we know that they didn't get sick by going, to the market? Just like it's been established that people that we know for a fact were infected with COVID, people who, got a diagnosis in the hospital in late November or December, or who got tested, in early January when they had a test for it. We know without any question that many people among the early cases of COVID either worked at the Huanan market, or they visited there, or they lived in the neighborhood. I'll get to this in more detail a little later, but it's over 150 people that we know had one of those three possible connections to the market. So how do we know that one or more of these workers, if they had COVID, didn't get it from visiting the market and bring it back to the lab, or maybe they were in contact with somebody else who had visited the market and gave it to them? We don't know that for sure. Okay, a little farther down, he says, when a source was asked how certain they were that these were the identities of three scientists who developed symptoms consistent with COVID-19 in the fall of 2019 before this virus spread around the world, we were told 100%. Now note that this source isn't saying it's 100% certain that they had COVID. They're saying they're 100% certain that these were the three people who developed symptoms consistent with COVID, which may or may not have been COVID. Let's see if there's anything else in here. Okay, well, let's take a look at the piece that Shellenberger and his colleagues published on Substack. So, title of the article, so it's Substack, so you know that they chose the title of the article and not the editors, like was probably the case with the New York Post article. So they make a definitive statement. First people sickened by COVID-19 were Chinese scientists at Wuhan Institute of Virology, say U.S. government sources. Okay, well, they at least qualify it by saying, say U.S. government sources, so you're not as absolute as Shellenberger's statement. According to multiple U.S. government officials interviewed as part of a lengthy investigation by Public and Racket, the Substack pages of these three authors. The first people infected by the virus, patient 0, included Ben Hu, a researcher who led the WIV's gain-of-function research on SARS-like coronaviruses, which increases the infectiousness of viruses. More than 3 years after the pandemic's outbreak, many around the world have given up on learning the origins of SARS-CoV-2. Sources within the U.S. government say that 3 of the earliest people to become infected with it were those 3 people. Okay, alright, so symptoms consistent with COVID-19, so they fudge a little bit there. Okay, well, let's see what another reporter says about this. Ryan Grimm with The Intercept. Documents link potential COVID patient 0 to U.S.-funded research in Wuhan. One of the first Wuhan researchers reportedly sick with COVID in fall 19, Ben Hu, blah, blah, blah. The news that U.S. intelligence had learned that 3 Wuhan Institute of Virology lab workers had been hospitalized with COVID symptoms in November 2019, significantly before the outbreak of the city's seafood market, was first reported by the Wall Street Journal, i.e. by one of the same reporters who claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction in May of 2021. And one thing that's odd here is that they just say, both Grimm and the people who published the original piece just say November 2019. They don't say when in November, because in fact the outbreak that was traced to the seafood market, the Huanan Seafood Wholesale Market, did start in November 2019, and late November 2019, the first cases as established by diagnosis in the hospital. The patients had symptoms that weren't quite, some of the symptoms were not like what the flu looks like. That happened in late November 2019. Let's see. The investigators spoke to 2 researchers working at a U.S. laboratory who were collaborating with the Wuhan Institute at the time of the outbreak. The Times reported. That's the London Times, another article that reported this. They said the Wuhan scientists had inserted a furin cleavage sites into viruses in 2019 in exactly the way proposed in Peter Daszak's failed funding application to DARPA. So supposedly this research proposed in a grant proposal by a U.S. scientist, Peter Daszak, was going to be doing gain-of-function research using insertion of COVID, furin cleavage sites, which are, I don't really want to go into the details here, which I'm not that familiar with anyway, but it's just a part of the virus that exists in not only the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but quite a few other coronaviruses. But anyway, again, as I said at the beginning, there are lots of scientists who've conducted research on the issue of where COVID came from, or are experts in that area and have followed it closely, and a pretty sizable majority of them think that it came from the market. And here's what one of them, Dr. Angela Rasmussen, who is one of the co-authors of a seminal paper in the journal Science, which I'll talk about a bit later. Here's what she had to say about Shellenberger's claim. So she says, flood the zone with shit. Um, if you're trying to get people to, buy into a particular point of view, is a favorite information warfare tactic. Um, and now the lab leak proponents are using the exact same playbook. I don't know what is in the intel on origins, but I suspect it will not contain profound revelations. I'm always open to new evidence, but to indicate lab origin, this has a high bar to clear. To consider, is there evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had a progenitor of SARS-CoV-2? Was there a close enough relative to SARS-CoV-2 that they could have genetically engineered it, inserted a furin cleavage site and whatnot? Or did they, in fact, have the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the virus that causes COVID, in the lab? If not, no lab leak. Well, at this point, there's not any evidence that there was any close relative to SARS-CoV-2 in the lab, close enough that they could have, engineered the virus through gain-of-function research. The closest that as far as anyone knows, they had in the lab is a virus called RATG13, which it's 4% different genetically from SARS-CoV-2, and that may not sound like much, but consider that's much greater than the genetic difference between, say, a human being and a pig, for example. And researchers who've tried to trace the evolutionary history of SARS-CoV-2 and its closest relatives believe that those two viruses, or the pathway that led to SARS-CoV-2 as well as RATG13, diverged several decades ago, like around 1980 or something. In fact, we don't have any evidence yet that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had a close enough relative of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, or in fact the SARS-CoV-2 virus itself. Can it explain the existing scientific evidence implicating animals at the Huanan market? If not, no lab leak. Why didn't it persuade most of the IC before? I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of what IC stands for, but I don't know. I'm assuming that she means the community of scientists who investigate this particular issue. It didn't. No lab leak. And I suspect some of the lab leak folks also anticipate this declassified information will not be revelatory, hence time to launch the disinformation bombs. China wants it to be from the market to cover up a lab leak, and Biden is a China simp, so the head of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence is going to fake a zoonotic origin for no reason besides China demanded it. Former ambassador and interim DNI head Richard Grinnell. Okay, so she goes on to say our original peer-reviewed research was published in Science. It does not prove where the initial spillover occurred, but it provides strong evidence that the epicenter of infection was the southwestern corner of the Huanan Wholesale Seafood Market, where animal sales occurred. Okay, let's take a brief look at what the evidence from that paper showed. The Huanan Seafood Wholesale Market in Wuhan was the early epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. Understanding how severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 emerged in 2019 is critical to preventing future zoonotic outbreaks before they become the next pandemic. The Huanan market was identified as a likely source of cases in early reports, but later this conclusion became controversial. We show here that the earliest known COVID-19 cases from December 2019, including those without reported direct links, were geographically centered on this market. We report that live SARS-CoV-2 susceptible mammals were sold at the market in late 2019, and that within the market, positive environmental samples and samples positive for the virus were spatially associated with vendors selling live mammals. Although there's insufficient evidence to define upstream events, that is, how exactly it got from wherever in the wild it came from originally to the market, our analyses indicate that the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 occurred through the live wildlife trade in China and shows that the Huanan market was the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. In a Substack piece, I briefly summarized this evidence. How infectious diseases and conspiracy theories go viral. Let's see. Let me find where I talked about it. So, as Christian Anderson, another of the co-authors of that science paper, says, the main reason why zoonosis, that is, origin from animals in the wild, originally bats, which harbor more coronaviruses than any other animal, certain species of bats, and tend not to get sick from them, and spread from an animal market, has overwhelmingly been regarded by scientists with relevant expertise as a most likely origin. The main reason is simple. Precedent. The trajectory of COVID's emergence looks very much like SARS. In both cases, a large proportion of the initial cases were associated with an animal market in November in a major population center, where thus there were many potential targets of infection. And although the animal species identified as a host of SARS-CoV-1 were not available to be tested for SARS-CoV-2 when the Chinese government closed down the Huanan market on January 1st, 2020, they were present at the market in late 2019. So we have animals like pangolins and what the hell are some of the others? Anyway, there are certain species that they verified were being sold in the market in late 2019. Oh, Christian took down his account. That's unfortunate. Have to revise my links. An important piece of context that Anderson discusses is that horseshoe bats, the animals most noted for harboring SARS-producing coronaviruses, live throughout Southeast Asia, including in the province that Wuhan, is in. So, there could have been bats close by that infected intermediate host animals that were then brought into the market. Because there are wild animal farms in many provinces in China, including Hubei province, which is the place in China where the largest share of SARS-CoV-1 infected animals were found during the SARS epidemic back in the early 2000s. They came from, in that case, they found actual animals infected with SARS, in animal markets in Guangdong, many of which had come from Hubei, the same province that Wuhan is in. A very large percentage of the early cases of COVID there in Wuhan had some connection to animal markets. 27 out of the 41 earliest identified cases were people who either had worked at or had visited the Huanan market. And an important aspect of that is that cases were identified based on diagnosis of people's symptoms, and eventually, in early January and thereafter, when they had developed a test for COVID by testing people, they weren't basing their conclusions on whether or not they had been to any animal market. Later on, the World Health Organization found that 55 out of 168 early cases, about 33%, were associated with the Huanan market, either workers or visitors. More than half of them had been to either that market or some other market. Okay, so just to summarize the conclusions of this paper in Science that Rasmussen and her colleagues worked on, they found that they were able to find out where in Wuhan 155 of the early cases lived. And by far the highest density of cases was in areas on the west side of the Yangtze River in central Wuhan. Whereas the average Wuhan resident lived 16 kilometers from the Huanan market, the average Wuhan resident who was infected with COVID during those first couple of months of the initial outbreak lived only 4 kilometers away from the market. That was particularly true for infected individuals who didn't have any known connection to the market. And statistically, for this to be the case, it was almost impossible. Furthermore, when the center point of all 155 cases was plotted, it was only 1 kilometer from the market. So here's the Huanan market, and here's the center point of where people lived who were among those early cases of COVID. Cases that were not linked to the market, in other words, they didn't work at the market or hadn't visited a market, lived less than 1 kilometer away from the market. So like a few football fields. Cases that had some link to the market were on average 2 kilometers away. Another paper, which some of the co-authors of that science paper collaborated on, found that there were likely at least 2 separate spillover events from animals to humans that occurred in the Huanan market roughly a week apart, involving 2 different lineages of the early COVID virus. And both of these outbreaks with separate lineages, lineage B being the one that ultimately led to the pandemic. Both of these lineages were strongly geographically associated with the market. So in order for it to be a lab leak that started the ball rolling, there would have had to have been visits to the market by workers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is 10 miles away from the market, on 2 separate occasions at least. And the other thing is that there's lots and lots of other places, about 400 other places in Wuhan that a lot more people visit than visit the Huanan market. So, why weren't those other places having outbreaks? If it's really true that there were people, um, that the first people to get infected with COVID were, 3 scientists from the Wuhan lab, why didn't outbreaks start at all the other places they um, are likely to have visited? Which, who knows if they visited the that particular seafood market, located quite a ways from the lab. Um, and the average person in Wuhan lives quite a distance from the lab. Um, but none of these other locations had an early outbreak. It wasn't until a couple of months into the pandemic that the virus had spread all over Wuhan. At first it hadn't. So the Huanan market outbreak wasn't just another super spreader event. All indications are that it was the original super spreader event, the one that initiated the pandemic. Now, bear in mind that the origin of the pandemic, the first outbreak, is not this. Establishing where that is not the same thing as establishing that there's a pandemic. So, regardless of whether regardless of whether that first outbreak of COVID in Wuhan was because it leaked out of the lab, or because people in the market got infected by infected animals. In either case, that doesn't mean you're going to have a pandemic. SARS didn't turn into a pandemic. There weren't cases of SARS all over the world. It wasn't as infectious as COVID, but also, the countries where it got in, did a really good job of clamping down on it. In the case of COVID, to blame China for the pandemic, is absurd, because China actually had very few early cases of COVID, because they locked down Hubei province completely, as well as the few other places where in China where it got out to. So, the places where COVID became a big problem were places that either waited too long to do something, or just didn't really do anything, or not very much, to control the spread of the virus. So that's why we had a pandemic, not because either it leaked from a lab because supposedly regulations of the lab were not good enough, or it began in the market because regulations on the market were not well enforced enough. Either of those two possibilities, if they're true, and it does look like something went wrong with the regulation of the markets, because it's not legal in China to sell wild animals in animal markets, but they were doing it. Neither of those things results in a pandemic. The only way you can have a pandemic is that if people in various places in the world don't take sufficient steps to contain the spread of the virus. Okay, well, one other piece of data they presented regarding exactly where in the market environmental samples testing positive for SARS-CoV-2 were found. Positive environmental samples were highly likely, very statistically significant likelihood, to be located in the southwest corner of the market where live animals were sold. And all 8 of the infected individuals who were known to have been in specific parts of the market had been in that area. Let's see if Angela has anything else to add here. Okay, so back in March, Rasmussen and her colleagues analyzed some newly released data on where viral samples were detected in the market and where the presence of different animals was detected in the market, and they were able to establish that the same exact stalls in the market where environmental samples of the virus were found were also stalls where raccoon dogs and minks and a certain kind of fox that is susceptible to COVID. They found genetic evidence that those animals had been present in those same exact places. So, again, they can't prove that this is how COVID happened, as well as they did with SARS, because in the case of SARS, they actually identified infected raccoon dogs, infected with SARS. They weren't able to do that in the case of the SARS-CoV-2 virus because what happened was that the moment that the Chinese government announced they were closing the market and testing the animals, a lot of the animals suddenly vanished. People didn't want to be caught with infected animals, suggesting that they were responsible for spreading the virus. And in particular, the animals that are known to be susceptible to carrying the coronavirus, like raccoon dogs, which were known to have been sold in the market, but it was illegal to do so. The relevant government authorities just didn't do anything about it. Those vendors, took all of those animals out. They were nowhere to be found. So there will never be, a possibility of, finding the, smoking raccoon dog, so to speak, that was responsible for spreading the virus out of the market. And what I find interesting about the story by Shellenberger and his colleagues. Let's see. Do I? Okay. Yeah, I read through it, and they didn't even mention anything about the evidence that I just went through regarding it having originated in the market. They didn't even talk about that. So, this strikes me as pretty indicative of bias on their part. They can't even, if you were going to fairly and objectively evaluate the hypotheses for, how COVID originated, you would review, all the evidence that you know of for both claims. So, if you look at the papers by people who've done research that points to, having originated in the market, like Angela Rasmussen, like Christian Anderson, Michael Worobi, and so forth, they talk about, why the evidence that exists points to zoonotic and market origin and not to a lab leak, and talk about that there just isn't any evidence beyond the word of government officials, U.S. government officials, that it came from the lab. Sherlock Holmes wrote a story once called The Adventure of Sir Blaise, where the way that Holmes was able to Arthur Conan Doyle. Sorry, not Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the detective in his stories. So, um, in the story, The Adventure of Sir Blaise, Sherlock Holmes tracks down who the murderer was by the fact that, a dog in the house where the murder occurred didn't bark at the time that the murder happened. So that suggested that the perpetrator and the dog knew each other. So the dog, didn't bark at him like he would at a stranger. Um, and you know, here we have a glaring omission from Shellenberger, Taibbi, and Gutenberg's piece, where they don't even talk at all about evidence that points to the likelihood of the virus having spread from the market. I'd really hope that Taibbi, who's one of the three authors, would say something about it in his own separate piece on his Substack blog, The Racket, but he didn't say a word about it. So, in short, I think that these people are not looking at the issue objectively. If you're going to give fair consideration to both hypotheses, you have to look at evidence on both sides, and they're just not doing it. And to be honest, what we have so far, I'm not saying that won't change, but what we have so far regarding the lab leak hypothesis is, it's not evidence, it's speculation, because there's no definitive proof that anybody from the lab got infected early on. We have the word of some U.S. government officials. So what? They don't talk about how they know that these three scientists were infected. There was a mass testing of everybody who worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology early on in the pandemic, in January of 2020, and nobody tested positive. Okay, so don't believe them if you want, I guess, but that is certainly is not any less evidence regarding the lab leak hypothesis than the claim by U.S. government officials, who are notoriously biased against the Chinese government, that they supposedly found evidence that these three workers were sick with COVID. Or an unspecified viral illness that might have been COVID. And, Shellenberger and his colleagues and others who've written about this can't seem to get their story straight. Sometimes they say, definitely these three scientists in the WIV lab had COVID, and other times they say, well, it looks like they might have had it. They had symptoms consistent with it, respiratory illness symptoms. So anyway, we'll keep watching and see what new evidence comes in. But at this point, it looks like really all of the evidence that we know, is not just somebody's word. Supports the fact that it came from the market and not the lab. So we'll stay tuned, and I'll keep following this story and reporting to you when anything new comes along. But to be honest, I don't think that Shellenberger, Taibbi, and Guttentag have uncovered anything new here. All right, see you next time.